What if the gods who created us were fleeing from something? What if the Anunnaki, those divine beings from Sumerian texts who descended from the sky to shape humanity out of clay and divine blood, were not conquerors claiming a new world, but refugees fleeing an old one? In the heat-cracked plains of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and the Euphrates once nourished the first cities, clay tablets still rest in museum display cases. Their cuneiform script carving warnings into the dried mud. 5,000 years ago, scribes recorded what the gods told them. We came here because we had nowhere else to go. Something followed us across the void and always ends up finding us. So before the story carries you away, if you are drawn to tales that whisper rather than shout, consider subscribing. Divine Refugees. Picture the British Museum on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, when the crowds thin out and the echo of footsteps fades into the vastness of the Mesopotamian galleries. There stands a glass case containing 7 clay tablets, which most visitors pass without a second glance. The tablets are broken, incomplete, their surfaces covered in wedge-shaped impressions that look almost like the tracks of birds pressed into the mud. The museum label reads, Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, circa 1100 BCE, and offers a brief explanation of ancient religious beliefs. The kind of neat academic framing that keeps everything safely contained within the realm of mythology. But if you were to lean close to the glass, close enough for your breath to fog the surface, and if you were to trace those cuneiform signs with your eyes, following the patterns that ancient scribes pressed into the wet clay over 3,000 years ago, you would find something that doesn't quite fit the comfortable narrative of primitive peoples inventing stories to explain their world. You would find a specificity of detail, of names of places, of relationships and conflicts, that reads less like abstract theology and more like history, like a chronicle, like the meticulous documentation of events that actually happened to beings who actually existed. Tonight, as the world quiets down around you and your thoughts begin their slow descent toward sleep, we are going to spend some time with these tablets and others like them, not as curiosities from a dead civilization, but as potential testimonies, as evidence, as the fragments of a history so ancient and so strange that we have forgotten how to read it properly. Close your eyes if you wish. Let your body settle into the surface supporting you. The journey we are embarking on requires no sight, only imagination and the willingness to follow a thread that leads where most scholars fear to tread. The tablets that make up the Enuma Elish were discovered in the ruins of Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital that fell in 612 BCE, when a coalition of Babylonians and Medes sacked the city and burned its libraries. Like so many treasures of the ancient Near East, these tablets survive because the fire did what it so often does to clay. It baked and hardened them, transforming them from fragile records into something bordering on permanence. The British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard recovered them in the 1850s, along with thousands of other tablets from a library of King Ashurbanipal. This scholarly monarch had gathered the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization into vast archives. The tablets traveled to London in wooden crates, were catalogued and stored away, and for decades they sat unread because no one alive could decipher the strange script they bore. Then, in the 1870s, as scholars slowly cracked the code of cuneiform, a young assistant at the British Museum named George Smith began working on the Nineveh tablets. And what he found would ultimately force a reconsideration of everything the Western world thought it knew about the origins of its own religious traditions. Smith is famous for discovering the Babylonian flood narrative, a story so similar to the biblical account of Noah that it caused a sensation in Victorian England. But the flood tablet was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The Enuma Elish tells a different story, or rather, the same story from a different angle, and the details it preserves about the beings it calls the Anunnaki raise questions that mainstream scholarship has never fully answered. Picture the landscape where these stories first took shape. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, rolling down from the mountains of what is now Turkey, spreading out across a vast alluvial plain before emptying into the Persian Gulf. In the summer, the heat is brutal. Temperatures climb to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is so dry, it splits your lips after just a few hours of exposure. In the winter, the rains arrive. Unpredictable and sometimes violent, turning the flat terrain into shallow lakes of stagnant water. This is not an easy place to live. This is not a place where civilization should logically emerge first. The soil is fertile enough, deposited by millennia of river floods, but there is almost no stone, almost no timber, almost no natural resources beyond mud and water. And the crops that can be coaxed from the earth are pulled forth at the cost of grueling labor. And yet here, in this improbable place, humans built the very first cities we can document. They developed the first writing system we know of. They created the first codes of law, the first schools, the first libraries, the first complex bureaucracies. Around 4500 BCE, the people we call the Sumerians established settlements in places like Eridu and Uruk, cities that would swell to house tens of thousands of inhabitants. Cities with massive temples and palaces and irrigation systems stretching for miles across the floodplain. Everything we consider civilization, the structures and systems that separate complex societies from simple villages, emerged in this hostile landscape over the course of about 2,000 years, a mere blink of an eye in archaeological terms. And the people who built these cities, who invented writing specifically to keep track of their increasingly complex affairs, left behind records of who they believed they were and where they believed they came from. These records speak consistently of beings called the Anunnaki, figures that appear in the Sumerian texts not as vague divine forces, not as abstractions representing natural phenomena, but as specific individuals with names, personalities, and complex relationships. The sky god, father of the pantheon. Enlil, the lord of the air, the stern commander who directed operations on earth. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh waters, the brilliant scientist and diplomat who so often intervened on humanity's behalf. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, impulsive and ambitious, who would eventually become Ishtar in the later Babylonian tradition. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, a specialist in biological creation. These are not hazy spiritual concepts. They are characters, beings with distinct voices and motivations that remain consistent across thousands of years of textual tradition. They argue, they make mistakes, they feel, fear, desire, exhaustion, and regret. In many ways, they seem more human than divine, more akin to powerful individuals wielding advanced capabilities than to the omniscient, omnipotent gods that later monotheistic traditions would conceive. And the texts are remarkably consistent on one crucial detail. The Anunnaki came from somewhere else. They descended, they arrived, they were not always here. The very word Anunnaki has been analyzed by scholars in various ways, but the most common interpretation breaks it down into An, meaning heaven, and Unaki, meaning princely offspring or noble seed. The Anunnaki are the princely offspring of heaven, the children of the sky, and text after text describes them descending from this celestial realm to take up residence on earth. In the Enuma Elish, the great council of the gods meets in heaven to determine cosmic destinies before some of them descend to establish order on earth. In the Epic of Atrahasis, the upper gods are called those of heaven, while the lower gods, the Igigi, are assigned to labor on earth. In hymns and prayers across the Sumerian corpus, the Anunnaki are invoked as beings who divided the cosmos among themselves, some remaining above, others descending into the underworld, and some taking the earth as their domain. This division is curious. If you are an eternal deity, if you have always existed and will always exist, if your power is limitless and your knowledge total, why would you need to divide territory? Why would some of you live in one place and some in another? Why would there be upper and lower ranks? These questions hover at the edge of the textual record, rarely asked, because asking them requires taking the texts more seriously than modern scholarship generally permits. But let's ask them anyway. Let's follow them where they lead. The Epic of Atrahasis, one of the oldest and most complete Mesopotamian creation accounts, does not open with the creation of the world, but with a crisis. When the gods, instead of man, did the work and bore the loads, the text begins. The burden of the gods was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too heavy. This is the setup, the context for everything that follows. Before humans existed, the gods themselves worked. More specifically, the lower gods, the Igigi, were engaged in what the text describes as grueling physical labor. For 40 years they toiled. 40 years of digging canals, dredging rivers, and moving earth to create the agricultural infrastructure of Mesopotamia. The number 40 appears symbolically throughout ancient Near Eastern literature to indicate a long, difficult period. So perhaps we shouldn't take it literally, but the nature of the work is described with striking specificity. These were not abstract divine tasks, like maintaining cosmic order or regulating celestial mechanics. This was practical, exhausting physical labor. Irrigation canals, drainage systems, the endless maintenance that made agriculture possible in a landscape prone to floods and droughts. The Igigi were terraforming. They were making the earth habitable for agriculture. And after 40 years, or whatever duration that period actually represents, they reached their breaking point. The scene of rebellion in the Atrahasis is dramatic and detailed. The Igigi gather outside the dwelling of Enlil the commander, the stern god in charge of their assignments. They don't just complain, they burn their tools, they throw down their instruments. They declare a work stoppage, a strike, a massive refusal to continue under these conditions. The text preserves what sounds almost like union rhetoric. Every one of us gods has declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. Our work is too hard, the trouble too much. The gods, it seems, can be killed, or at least worn down to the point of destruction. This is not how we usually think of divine beings. Omnipotent entities do not get tired. All-powerful creators do not rebel against their working conditions. Something in this account does not match our assumptions of what gods are, and the ancient scribes who preserved these stories did not seem to share those assumptions. They recorded what they had received, what had been passed down through generations, what they believed to be true, even if it presented a picture of divinity that was complicated, limited, perhaps even vulnerable. Enlil's first response to the rebellion is exactly what one might expect from a stern authority figure faced with insubordination. He is furious. He wants to punish the ringleaders, make examples of them, crush the uprising with overwhelming force to prevent any future challenge to his authority. But Anu, the father of the sky, and Enki, the god of wisdom, counsel a different approach. Find out who started this, Anu suggests. Investigate, understand. And Enki, always the problem solver, proposes a revolutionary alternative. Rather than punishing the workers for rebelling against unfair conditions, rather than forcing them back to work through intimidation, why not address the underlying problem? Why not remove the need for their labor entirely? Let one god be slaughtered, Enki says. From his flesh and blood, let Ninhursag, the goddess of birth, mix the clay. Let God and man be intimately mixed in the clay. Let there be a spirit from the god's flesh. Let it make its sign known to the living. Let there be a spirit so that it is not forgotten. The solution is creation. The solution is humanity. Let your breathing slow for a moment. Feel the weight of your body against the surface holding you. You don't need to follow every detail. Let the story wash over you like water, like the flood that will eventually come. We are building something here, a picture, a pattern. The pieces will come together in due time. What Enki proposes, and what the Divine Council ultimately accepts, is the creation of a new species specifically designed to take over the work that the Igigi refused to continue. Humans are not created to worship. Humans are not created for spiritual communion with the divine. Humans are created to bear the yoke, to take on the chores of the gods, to relieve the divine workers of their burden. The language is explicit, repeated, unambiguous. We are, according to these ancient texts, a labor force, a replacement crew, a solution to a staffing crisis. That is unsettling enough on its own, but it becomes even stranger when you examine the creation process in detail. Because creating humans, according to the Atrahasis and related texts, was not easy. It was not a simple act of divine will. It was a complex biological procedure that required specific materials, specific expertise, specific conditions, and multiple attempts before it succeeded. The procedure begins with a sacrifice. A god must die. This text names him Wei-Ilu, sometimes called Geshtu-i, and in other versions specifies that he is a god who has intelligence, who has sense. This is important. They don't choose just any deity for this ritual slaughter. They deliberately select someone whose essence contains the specific quality they want to pass on to their creation. The capacity for rational thought, for understanding, for following instructions. Wei-Ilu is killed, and his blood and flesh are collected. The text describes these materials as containing his spirit, his intelligence, his essential nature. Next, these divine biological materials are mixed with clay, but not just any clay. The text specifies it must come from the Abzu, the primordial ocean of fresh water believed to exist deep beneath the earth, the domain of Enki himself. It is a pure, uncontaminated material, the original stuff of creation. The mixture of divine flesh and blood with sacred clay is then divided into 14 portions, 7 for males and 7 for females. The text is precise about this bilateral creation, and these portions are not simply shaped into human form by divine will. They are implanted into the wombs of 14 birth goddesses who will act as surrogates. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, oversees the procedure. There is a gestation period. There is waiting. There is uncertainty. And then finally, the first humans are born. 7 males and 7 females, created to carry the burden the gods no longer wanted to bear. Think for a moment about what this narrative is actually describing. It describes the creation of a new sentient species through a process that looks remarkably like genetic engineering. Divine genetic material mixed with a terrestrial substrate. Surrogate mothers carrying hybrid embryos. A gestation period allowing for development. Specific traits intentionally selected and passed down. If you stripped away the theological language, if you translated clay into a modern equivalent like cellular medium and divine blood into something like genetic material, you would have a description quite similar to what happens in a modern biotechnology lab. The ancient scribes didn't have words like DNA or genome. They didn't have concepts like genetic engineering or surrogacy. But they described something, and what they described has a structure, a specificity, a procedural quality that sits uncomfortably with the standard interpretation of these texts as purely mythological. Perhaps they were describing something real, using the only vocabulary they had. Perhaps they were encoding knowledge that has taken us thousands of years to redevelop independently. And then there are the failures. The text of Enki and Ninmah, found on tablets from Nippur and dating to roughly the same period as the Atrahasis, tells a different, darker part of the story. After the initial success, after the first humans are created and put to work, there is a celebration. The gods feast and drink, and then, intoxicated and proud, Enki and Ninmah enter into a challenge. Ninmah claims that as the goddess of birth, she holds ultimate power over the human form, that she can make humans good or bad, whole or broken, according to her will. Enki counters that whatever form she creates, no matter how flawed, he can find a use for it. He can make even her worst creation purposeful. What follows is a catalog of failed prototypes, and the details with which they are described are unsettling in their clinical precision. First, Ninmah creates a man whose hands cannot stretch, who cannot grasp. His hands are paralyzed, frozen, useless. He cannot hold a tool, cannot feed himself properly. In ancient society, this would seem to be a wholly disqualifying condition. But Enki examines this being and immediately assigns him a specific role. He will serve the king directly. He cannot steal because he cannot grasp objects. He cannot raise a hand to strike. His disability becomes his qualification, his guarantee of reliability. Second, Ninmah creates a blind man. No sight, no ability to navigate independently, no capacity for tasks requiring vision. Here again, Enki finds a purpose. This being has lost one sense, but will compensate with the others. He will be a musician, a singer, his hearing more acute than that of the sighted. Third, a being with crippled feet. Enki assigns him work that can be done sitting down, silversmithing perhaps, or jewelry making. Fourth, a man who cannot control his bodily functions, incontinent, a social outcast. Enki performs what the text calls magic, though we might call it medical treatment. A ritual bath drives the illness away. He is cured and made functional. Fifth, a woman who cannot bear children. In a society where female value was largely tied to fertility, this should render her useless. But Enki assigns her to the queen's household as a weaver, her hands creating cloth, instead of her womb creating life. Sixth, and this is where the text becomes truly remarkable. Ninma creates a being without male or female genitalia. The text calls this being a genderless one, often translated as a eunuch, but seeming to describe someone born without sexual characteristics rather than surgically altered. And Enki gives this genderless person a position of honored service before the king. The text validates a third gender category millennia before modern discussions of such concepts. 6 times Ninma tries to create something so broken that even Enki's wisdom cannot save it. 6 times she fails to trap him. He finds a purpose for every flaw, a role for every disability. But then Enki decides to demonstrate his own creative power, or perhaps his cruelty. He takes clay and shapes something he names Umul, a word whose meaning is debated, but seems to indicate something born prematurely, incompletely formed. The description is fragmentary but horrifying. A being who cannot speak, cannot eat, cannot move properly, cannot even lie down comfortably. Some translations suggest he cannot control his head, that his neck is too weak to support his skull. This is not just a disability. It is an existence in a state that the text itself describes as neither fully alive nor dead. Enki presents this creation to Ninma and challenges her. Now you find a purpose for this. Make it useful. And she cannot. She tries to feed him, but he cannot swallow. She tries to communicate, but he cannot answer. Finally, in despair, she admits defeat. This being, she says, is beyond her power to help. What are we to make of this text? Mainstream scholarship interprets it as an ancient Mesopotamian theodicy, an explanation of why some humans are born with disabilities, a mythological framework for understanding and integrating human diversity. It's a reasonable interpretation, and it may well be correct. But there is another way to read it. What if this text wasn't explaining disability in an already established species? What if it was documenting the trial and error process of creating that species in the first place? What if these were not metaphors for congenital anomalies, but descriptions of actual failed prototypes, experimental models that failed to meet the specifications of iteration in a development process? The structure of the text supports this reading. This is not presented as continuous natural variation, but as a discrete creation event, a manufacturing process where specific beings are created one by one, examined, evaluated, and then assigned a purpose or discarded. The language is systematic. The failures are methodically catalogued. It reads less like mythology and more like quality control documentation. If you've drifted off, that's perfectly fine. Let these ideas settle like sediment at the bottom of an ancient river. The picture we are building will become clearer as we move forward. Now, let's ask the question that hovers over all of this. If the Anunnaki were gods in the traditional sense, omnipotent beings who could will reality into existence, why would any of this be necessary? Why would creation be difficult? Why would there be failed prototypes? Why would the lower gods need to work? And why would their work be so exhausting that they would rebel? The Atrahasis describes divine beings who get tired, who experience grueling labor, who can be killed by work. It describes a creation process that requires physical materials, specific procedures. Surrogate mothers gestation periods, and multiple attempts. It describes a hierarchy of species where some gods live in comfort while others toil. None of this aligns with the concept of omnipotent divinity that later religions would develop. But it all makes sense if we consider a different interpretation. What if the Anunnaki were not gods in a cosmic sense? What if they were simply beings more advanced than early humans? Beings endowed with capabilities that seemed divine, but were ultimately limited. Beings who came to Earth not as all-powerful creators, but as something more complicated, more vulnerable, more desperate. The texts are consistent on one point. The Anunnaki divided themselves. Some stayed in heaven, others descended into the underworld. Some took the earth as their domain. This division appears across multiple textual sources, and it is treated as a deliberate strategic arrangement rather than a natural state of being. In the Enuma Elish, once the cosmic battles have been won and order established, Marduk distributes the Anunnaki to their assigned places. 300 in heaven, 300 on or under the earth. Why this division? If you are an eternal being with limitless power, why would location matter? Why would some of you need to be in different places? But if you are refugees, if you are survivors of a catastrophe, or if you are fleeing a threat, if you need to establish a presence in multiple locations to ensure that at least part of your group survives whatever is coming next, then division makes perfect sense. You scatter. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. You establish fallback positions. You prepare for the possibility that whatever you are running from will eventually find you. What were they running from? The texts don't say directly, but they leave traces, they leave patterns, they leave hints of something beyond even the gods themselves. Something older, something dangerous, something that existed before the current cosmic order, and that might still exist out there in the dark between the worlds. We will explore these hints in the hours to come. We will follow the thread through the flood narratives and the astronomical records through the architecture of the ziggurats and the concept of the Abzu, through comparative mythology and modern science, looking for the shape of something the ancient scribes were trying to warn us about, but could only describe using the vocabulary they possessed. For now, let these foundations settle. Let the image of Earth as a refuge rather than a reward take shape in your mind. Allow the possibility to exist, however unsettling it may be, that humanity was created not out of divine love or cosmic design, but out of desperate necessity. That we are the emergency solution to a labor crisis, that our creators were themselves fleeing something, and that the world we inherited might bear the scars of what they feared. Feel your body growing heavier. Feel your thoughts beginning to soften at the edges. The ancient cities are silent now, buried under millennia of dust, sand, and sediment. The tablets that preserve these stories rest in climate-controlled museum cases, their secrets waiting for anyone with the patience to read them closely. And you, lying in the dark, are part of the chain of transmission that keeps these stories alive. The Sumerian scribes passed them to the Babylonian scribes, who passed them to the Assyrian scribes, who preserved them in libraries that burned, and yet somehow survived. European archaeologists dug them out of the ruins and shipped them to museums where scholars slowly decoded them. And now, the stories continue, passed along in different forms, through different mediums, but carrying the same questions they always have. Who created us? Why are we here? And what if anything, are we supposed to be afraid of? The answers, if they exist, might be encoded in texts we can read, but not yet fully comprehend. Tonight, we begin the work of understanding. Tonight, we ask ourselves what the ancients were trying to tell us. And perhaps, in the space between waking and sleeping, we will catch a glimpse of the truth they preserved in clay and fire, and in the long memory of human storytelling. Rest now, but not too deeply. We still have a long way to go before morning comes. Celestial cosmography. The heaven from which the Anunnaki descended was not a vague spiritual realm floating in abstraction, but a structured cosmos with a specific geography named regions. Distinct territories governed by particular deities, and most intriguingly, measurable distances and observable phenomena that the ancient astronomers of Mesopotamia tracked with remarkable precision over centuries of meticulous observation. When we speak of the Anunnaki's descent from heaven, we are not talking about a metaphorical fall from grace or a symbolic emergence from divine thought, but a journey through a cosmos that the Sumerians understood in a way that combined what we would separate today into theology and astronomy, into mythology and cosmography, into religious narratives and navigational data. The Mesopotamian universe was structured in layers, 7 heavens stacked above the earth like the tiers of a ziggurat, each level associated with specific celestial bodies, each governed by specific gods, each possessing its own character and function in the cosmic order. The lowest heaven belonged to the moon domain of the god Sin, whose crescent symbol appears on countless cylinder seals and temple inscriptions. Above that, the heaven of Mercury, then Venus, the brilliant morning and evening star, sacred to Inanna. Then the sun in its blazing glory. Then red and menacing Mars. Then Jupiter, the king of the wandering stars. And finally, Saturn, at the visible edge, the highest of the planetary realm. But beyond Saturn, beyond the 7 wandering stars that ancient eyes could track against the fixed backdrop of the constellations, there were other heavens, realms that belonged to Anu, the supreme god of the sky regions that the astronomical texts mention but do not fully explain. Areas of the cosmos where things moved in patterns the scribes recorded but perhaps didn't entirely understand. The Mulapin tablets, these extraordinary astronomical compendiums dating to around 1000 BCE, but clearly building on observational traditions stretching back millennia, contain the most systematic Mesopotamian record of celestial phenomena to survive to the present day. These tablets divide the sky into 3 bands, 3 paths traveled by the celestial bodies. The path of Enlil in the north, the path of Anu in the central equatorial band, and the path of Ea in the south. Each path contains specific stars and constellations, specific risings and settings carefully noted, specific phenomena to watch for at specific times of the year. The precision is remarkable. This was not casual sky watching, but systematic astronomy, building a cumulative record over generations, tracking the movements of the planets against the background of the stars, noting when certain stars rose just before dawn in different seasons, creating what amounts to a comprehensive astronomical database, encoded in cuneiform. They tracked the moon through its phases and predicted eclipses with reasonable accuracy. They followed Venus through its complex pattern of appearance and disappearance, the morning star becoming the evening star, becoming the morning star again, through an 8-year cycle they understood precisely. They charted Jupiter and Saturn through their slow journey across the zodiacal band. All of this is well documented and well understood by modern scholars. Evidence of a sophisticated observational astronomy conducted systematically over centuries. But here is what troubles certain researchers who look at these texts with fresh eyes, with questions that mainstream scholarship tends to dismiss as fringe speculation. The MUL-APIN tablets and related astronomical texts occasionally reference phenomena that do not correspond to any celestial body we can identify. Objects with orbital periods that don't match known planets, appearances and disappearances that don't fit established patterns. References to something called Nibiru, a word that appears in multiple contexts and has generated enormous controversy in recent decades, largely due to the claims of Zecharia Sitchin that Nibiru was a 12th planet in our solar system, the homeworld of the Anunnaki, following a vast elliptical orbit that brings it through the inner solar system every 3,600 years. Now, let's be clear as the gathering darkness at the edge of your vision allows. The specific claims Sitchin made about Nibiru, its orbital period, its function as the Anunnaki homeworld, rely on translations and interpretations that mainstream Assyriologists largely reject. His reading of the ancient texts has been heavily criticized by scholars who can actually read Sumerian and Akkadian, who point out errors and overinterpretations in his work, who argue that Nibiru, in its original context, simply meant a crossing point, or a ferry, perhaps referring to Jupiter at certain positions in its orbit, when it seemed to cross from one region of the sky to another. This critique is valid and must be taken seriously. We should not build elaborate alternate histories on a foundation of poor translation. And yet, dismissing Sitchin's specific claims does not entirely resolve the underlying questions. Why do the astronomical texts refer to phenomena whose characteristics don't match known celestial bodies? Why do some tablets describe cycles and appearances that remain unexplained? Why did Mesopotamian astronomers pay such close attention to tracking things we can no longer identify today? The answer may simply be that our reconstruction of their astronomical knowledge is incomplete, that we have lost the context that would make these references clear, that what seems anomalous to us made perfect sense to scribes who possessed information we lack. That is the safest explanation and likely the correct one. But consider another possibility, not as a certainty, not as a claim, but as a question worth asking in the quiet hours when conventional answers feel less satisfying. What if the Mesopotamian astronomers were tracking something real that we have since lost sight of? What if certain phenomena they observed haven't recurred since the fall of their civilization? Phenomena with cycles longer than the span of recorded history we can verify. What if their meticulous astronomical records weren't even just scientific curiosity, but strategic surveillance, watching the skies in expectation of the return of something they had known from older times, something their ancestors had encountered and feared? This brings us to a more unsettling line of inquiry. Speculative, certainly, but following patterns present in the texts themselves, rather than importing modern fantasies onto ancient documents. If the Anunnaki descended from heaven, if they came from somewhere within that structured cosmos the Mesopotamians mapped so carefully, the question arises: was Earth their first destination or their last? Were they pioneers exploring a virgin world, or refugees seeking shelter after the loss of their previous home. The texts themselves contain curious clues that mainstream interpretation tends to dismiss as mere mythological flourishes, but which take on an entirely different meaning if we allow other questions to be asked. Consider the hierarchy among the Anunnaki themselves. Why are there upper and lower gods? If these beings are eternal, if they have always existed in their current form, the usual scholarly answer is that such hierarchies reflect human social structures projected onto the divine realm. That the Sumerians imagined their gods just as they imagined their own kings and nobles, with ranks, privileges, and chains of command. This is almost certainly part of the explanation. Humans do indeed tend to shape their gods in their own image, or at least in the image of their social arrangements. But the specificity of the Anunnaki hierarchy goes beyond simple projection. There are the great gods, the seven who decree fates, the higher powers who made the fundamental decisions. There are the Anunnaki of heaven, the Anunnaki of earth, and the Anunnaki of the underworld. Three groups deployed across three different cosmic zones, as if assigned to posts. There are the Igigi, the lower gods, who labored before the creation of humans, who rebelled against their workloads, who forced the crisis leading to humanity's creation. This is not a simple hierarchical projection. It is a detailed organizational structure with specific functions, specific territories, specific histories of conflict and resolution. It reads less like abstract theology and more like the organizational chart of a colonization expedition, complete with a command structure, territorial assignments, labor disputes, and the creation of a working class. To handle tasks the original personnel refused to continue performing. The creation texts contain even more suggestive material when read with this question in mind. The Enuma Elish, that great Babylonian epic of creation found in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, does not open with the creation of the universe, but with a state of primordial existence before the current cosmic order was established. In the beginning, the text tells us, there was Apsu, the sweet water, and Tiamat, the salt water, mingling their waters together. And from their union, the first gods were born. But these first gods were rowdy. They made noise. They disturbed Apsu. They troubled the primordial peace. Apsu wanted to destroy them. The god Ea discovered the plot and killed Apsu, first establishing his dwelling upon Apsu's body, creating the Abzu that became his sacred domain. But Tiamat remained, nursing her rage, eventually driven to war against the younger gods by advisors who reminded her of Apsu's murder. She created 11 monsters, terrible beings, described with unsettling specificity. The viper, the dragon, the sphinx, the great lion, the mad dog, the scorpion man, the dragonflies, the centaur, and others. Creatures that combine biological categories in impossible ways, suggesting either the imagination of a fever dream or the memory of something truly alien, truly other, truly terrifying. The younger gods trembled before Tiamat and her monsters. None wanted to face her until Marduk, young and ambitious, agreed to champion their cause in exchange for supreme kingship over all the gods. He fought Tiamat, killed her, split her body to form the heavens and the earth, captured her monsters and made them servants of the new cosmic order. This is the standard narrative, generally interpreted as a creation myth, explaining how cosmic order emerged from primordial chaos. How the younger generation of gods established their reign by defeating the old powers. How the tutelary deity of Babylon, Marduk, claimed the supreme position through a heroic victory. All of this is a valid interpretation, well supported by textual evidence and comparative mythology. But notice what the myth also says, what it perhaps encodes beneath the theological narrative. There was conflict before the current order. There were terrible enemies, beings capable of creating monsters. The victory did not destroy these forces entirely, but imprisoned them, repurposed them, incorporated them into a system that required constant maintenance. The current cosmic arrangement is not eternal or inevitable, but the result of a war that was won, but perhaps not definitively ended. What if Tiamat and her monsters were not mythological abstractions, but designations for something the Anunnaki had encountered before? What if the Enuma Elish preserves not just the theology of creation, but the institutional memory of conflicts fought elsewhere, of enemies faced before Earth was ever reached? The forces that had driven previous colonies to ruin and sent survivors fleeing toward new worlds. This is speculation, let us be clear about that. A speculation without proof, without the kind of evidence that would satisfy academic standards. But it is a speculation that follows a pattern that connects dots the texts themselves suggest, that asks why creation myths so consistently describe a cosmic war rather than a peaceful generation. Why the establishment of order requires the defeat and imprisonment rather than the destruction of primordial forces. Why the anxiety concerning the return or release of these forces runs through Mesopotamian religious literature like a red thread of persistent terror. The rituals performed in Mesopotamian temples included vast protective incantations, elaborate ceremonies designed to keep malevolent forces at bay, to maintain cosmic boundaries, to ensure that what was imprisoned stayed imprisoned. These were not mere symbolic acts or psychological comforts. The texts treat them as functionally necessary, as maintenance procedures for a cosmic order that required active upkeep, lest it deteriorate and let something terrible slip through. What were they so afraid of? What had taught them that such elaborate precautions were necessary? What memory passed down through generations had instilled such a persistent fear? Let your breathing slow for a moment. Feel the weight of your body against the surface, supporting you. Notice how the darkness seems deeper now, how the quiet feels more complete, how the boundary between waking thought and dream seems far too thin as the hour grows late. You do not need to follow every detail of what I am saying. Let the words wash over you like water, like the primordial waters of the Abzu, carrying you deeper into a territory where questions exist without demanding immediate answers. What we are exploring is not a thesis to be defended, but a pattern to be perceived, a possibility to be considered. In the space between certainty and dream. If these beings were on the run, the question that arises now demands consideration. Were the Sumerians alone in preserving the memory of divine refugees? Or does this pattern appear elsewhere, in traditions that developed independently? In mythologies separated by oceans and millennia from the dusty tablets of Mesopotamia. The Book of Enoch, that strange Jewish apocalyptic text, preserved not in the Hebrew Bible, but in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and in fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, speaks of beings called the Watchers, divine beings who descended from heaven, who took human wives, who taught forbidden knowledge to humanity, and who were terribly punished for their transgression. The Watchers are described as angels, but the account of their descent carries nuances that resonate unsettlingly with what we have explored in the Mesopotamian tradition. They descended from heaven, which in Second Temple Jewish cosmology meant the celestial realm, the abode of divine beings, a structured cosmos with multiple levels and specific inhabitants. They did not come in glory to deliver a revelation, but in secret to pursue their own objectives. They brought knowledge, specific technical knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, weaponry, astrology, the reading of signs, arts that the text treats as transgressive, as things humanity was not supposed to know, as information transferred against divine will, or at least outside of divine approval. And for this, they were punished. The Watchers were bound, imprisoned, cast into darkness until the day of final judgment. Their offspring, the giants, called Nephilim, were destroyed by the flood. The knowledge they had passed on was not erased, but its source was suppressed, its teachers imprisoned, its illegitimacy established. Notice the structure. Beings descend from a celestial realm. They bring knowledge and technology. They face consequences, imprisonment, the destruction of what they created. The pattern echoes what we find in the Mesopotamian tradition, not identically, but recognizably. The same fundamental story, wearing different cultural garments. The Vedic tradition of ancient India, developing thousands of miles away from Mesopotamia, contains its own accounts of cosmic conflict and divine descent. The Devas and the Asuras, divine beings, locked in an eternal struggle for cosmic supremacy. A struggle for the Amrita, the nectar of immortality. A battle across the ages, rises and falls, in cycles measured in millions of years. The concept of the avatar, literally descent, describes how the god Vishnu periodically descends into the material world in various forms: fish, turtle, boar, and man. Each descent responding to a crisis, an imbalance, a demon or enemy that threatens the cosmic order. The Vishnu Purana describes Vishnu's avatars appearing whenever Dharma declines, and Adharma rises, whenever the scales tip too far toward chaos, whenever intervention becomes necessary. But notice what this implies: the necessity for repeated intervention, the expectation that order will degrade without active maintenance. The pattern of crisis and response repeating across unimaginable stretches of time. The yugas themselves, those vast ages of the world we explored earlier, describe not a linear progress, but a cyclical decline, each age shorter and more corrupt than the last, leading inevitably to dissolution and renewal. The Satya Yuga, where beings lived for thousands of years, gives way to the Treta, where life and virtue shorten, then to the Dvapara Yuga, then to the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, the Dark Age we are said to inhabit now, where lifespans are brief, justice is rare, and the world deteriorates toward its eventual destruction and rebirth. This is not the narrative of confident divine control, but of a constant struggle against entropy, against forces that erode whatever order has been established, against something that keeps returning no matter how many times it is defeated. Greek mythology speaks of the Titans, the older generation of gods, overthrown by the Olympians under Zeus in a war called the Titanomachy, a cosmic conflict that resulted not in the destruction of the Titans, but in their imprisonment in Tartarus, that deepest pit of the underworld, chained and guarded forever. Forever. Except that Greek myth also knows the anxiety of a possible release, of what might happen if the old powers escaped their bonds, of what the Olympians might face if their ancient enemies returned. The Titans were not evil in a simple moral sense. They were simply other, older, belonging to a prior cosmic order that had been replaced but not entirely eliminated. Cronus, who swallowed his children. Prometheus, who stole fire for humanity. Atlas, who holds up the sky. These are complex figures, not simple villains, but representatives of a bygone age, of a previous arrangement of cosmic power. And the Greeks remembered in their myths, if not in their conscious theology, that the current order was not eternal, that it had been established by war, that what preceded it persisted somewhere, chained but not destroyed, defeated but not dead. Hesiod's Theogony, that ancient attempt to systematize Greek divine genealogy, describes generation after generation of cosmic rulers, each generation ousting the previous one through violence. Cronus castrating Uranus, Zeus imprisoning Cronus. The pattern of fathers overthrown by sons repeating until Zeus establishes a more stable regime through various means and compromises, alliances and arrangements that his predecessors had not managed. But even Zeus's reign wasn't entirely secure. Prophecies warned of a son who would surpass him. Threats always hovered at the edges of the Olympian order. The Titans in Tartarus waited. The monsters defeated by heroes, Typhon and the giants, along with the various serpents and dragons, had been contained but not destroyed. The Greek cosmos, like the Mesopotamian one, required constant upkeep against forces that would tear it apart if given the chance. Across the Atlantic, in traditions that developed in complete isolation from Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures, we find narratives that, while obviously distinct in their specifics, carry strikingly similar structural elements. The Mayan Popol Vuh describes multiple attempts at human creation, multiple destructions and renewals of the world, gods who struggled against primordial forces, a cosmos in which the current order emerged from conflict rather than peaceful generation. The Aztecs spoke of 5 suns, 5 ages of the world, each ending in catastrophic destruction. The current sun, the 5th, being itself doomed to destruction by earthquakes. The feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl, that mysterious deity who appears across Mesoamerican cultures under various names, was associated with knowledge civilization, the calendar, writing, the arts of culture. He was also associated with departure and promised return, with a narrative of leaving and coming back, with a cycle that would eventually fulfill itself. The Spanish conquistadors exploited this expectation by presenting themselves as the returning Quetzalcoatl, or his emissaries. But the expectation itself predated them, anchored in indigenous tradition, waiting for something or someone to return from across the sea. What were they waiting for? What cultural memory had encoded this pattern of departure and return of divine beings who brought knowledge, who left, and who might come back? I am not claiming that these traditions all derive from a single source, that they all describe the exact same historical events, that they all preserve the memory of the same beings. The differences among them are vast. The cultural contexts are entirely distinct. The specific narratives diverge in countless ways. Scholars who study comparative mythology rightly warn against facile equations that flatten these differences, that impose a single template onto diverse human religious expressions, that see the same story everywhere and ignore the unique characteristics of each tradition. That warning is valid and must be heeded. And yet the convergent pattern remains striking, even when we acknowledge the differences. Beings who come from elsewhere, who bring knowledge, who face primordial forces, who establish an order that requires maintenance, who perhaps have been somewhere before, who perhaps have faced the same forces previously, who perhaps are on the run, still fleeing even now. This pattern appears too consistently to be dismissed as mere coincidence, too widely to be explained simply by cultural diffusion from a single source, too specifically to be reduced to generic human projections of social structure onto the divine realm. Something in this pattern resonates, something that multiple human cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, have independently recognized, or remembered, or sensed. Perhaps it is simply the structure of human psychology, the way we inevitably imagine cosmic order emerging from conflict, the way we anthropomorphize natural forces into divine beings with histories and hierarchies. That is the standard scholarly explanation, and it has much to offer. But perhaps, just perhaps, the pattern appears because multiple human cultures have preserved each, in their own way, fragments of something real, of something that actually happened, of something that left traces in cultural memory, traces too deep to be entirely erased, even across thousands of years of independent development. What could leave such traces? What could imprint itself so deeply upon human consciousness that uncontacted cultures would independently develop similar narratives of divine descent, cosmic conflict, the imprisonment rather than destruction of primordial forces, and a persistent anxiety about their return or release? These questions hover at the edge of what can be studied through conventional means, in the territory where scholarship becomes speculation, where evidence becomes pattern recognition, where certainty becomes possibility. But in the softness of the quiet night, in the space between waking and sleeping, these questions seem less far-fetched than they do under the harsh light of academic scrutiny. Something frightened the Anunnaki. Something threatened them enough that they came here, created a workforce to build defenses or extract materials, established elaborate systems of ritual protection, and eventually withdrew or fled or fell into silence. Something lingers in the background of Mesopotamian religion, like a persistent dread, like the fear that those who were imprisoned might escape, like the anxiety that the cosmic order requires constant maintenance lest it collapse. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk's victory over Tiamat and her 11 monsters, but it does not describe their destruction. They were captured, chained, repurposed, incorporated into the cosmic order Marduk established. The body of Tiamat became the heavens and the earth. Her monsters became the servants of the gods. But the forces they represented were not eliminated, only contained. What happens when containment fails? What happens when the structures designed to hold them degrade over time? When the rituals meant to maintain the barriers are no longer performed? When the beings who knew how to keep the old forces imprisoned are gone, fled to another refuge while there was still time? The Abzu warrants closer attention here. That primordial ocean of fresh water beneath the earth that Enki made his domain after killing Apsu. Those mysterious depths from which the clay to create humanity was drawn. That border zone between the ordered world above and whatever lies below. In Sumerian cosmology, the Abzu was not just a physical place, but a cosmic principle, the source of all the fresh water that sustains life, the deep foundation upon which the ordered world rests. The temple of Enki at Eridu, The oldest city in Sumer, according to their own tradition, was called the Abzu, the House of the Abzu, and it was built directly over what was believed to be the opening to those primordial depths. The temple was not simply a place of worship, but a boundary marker, a cosmic technology, a structure that mediated between realms and maintained the separation between what needed to remain apart. The rituals performed there were not merely ceremonial, but functional. Procedures to maintain the cosmic order, to keep the Abzu in its proper state, to ensure that what dwelt in its depths stayed in its place. Think about that for a moment. Let the implications settle into your consciousness as your body grows heavier and your thoughts begin to drift. The oldest temple, in what may be the oldest city of the oldest civilization we can document, was built as a barrier, as a guardian structure, as a way to keep something confined. Not as a launching pad to the heavens, but as a seal over an opening to another place, a place below, a place that required constant attention lest its contents escape. The ziggurats that characterized Mesopotamian sacred architecture. These massive step pyramids that rose above the flat plains like artificial mountains have generally been interpreted as attempts to reach heaven, as platforms for divine descent, as meeting points between the earthly and celestial realms. This interpretation is well supported. The ziggurats did indeed function as temples, served as stages for religious rituals, represented the cosmic mountain connecting earth to heaven in Mesopotamian religious thought. But consider another possibility, not exclusive to the first, but complementary. What if the ziggurats also had a protective function? What if they were not just platforms reaching upward, but also markers, nodes in a network, points of cosmic stability that anchored the ordered world against forces that might destabilize it? What if they were watchtowers, monitoring not only the skies above, but also the depths below? The orientations of these structures were precise, aligned to astronomical phenomena, positioned according to principles we may not fully understand. The materials used for their construction were specific: mud bricks and baked bricks, and sometimes precious materials whose inclusions served no obvious structural purpose. The rituals that took place there were complex, time-consuming, resource-intensive, maintained for centuries, despite the cost, as if the consequences of abandoning them were too terrible to risk. The ziggurats have mostly crumbled today, melting back into the plains from which they rose. Their ritual functions long abandoned their precise purposes, lost in the gaps of our knowledge. Whatever they protected against, whatever they maintained, whatever function they served, beyond the obvious one of impressive religious architecture, that function is no longer being fulfilled today. The watchtowers are unguarded. The barriers are left untended. If they kept something out or kept something in, that watch has ended. The pattern of flight we have traced through Mesopotamian texts and comparative mythology leads to questions we cannot answer definitively, suggestions we cannot conclusively prove, possibilities we can only entertain in the speculative space between established knowledge and imaginative reconstruction. But the questions themselves are important, even if the answers remain elusive. Why did the Anunnaki have such a desperate need for workers that they created an entirely new species to provide labor? What were they building? What were they extracting? What required such urgent and sustained effort? Why did they establish such elaborate ritual systems of protection and maintenance systems that consumed massive resources and continued for millennia? What were they protecting themselves from? Why did they eventually withdraw, becoming progressively more distant, their direct involvement giving way to communication through dreams and omens, their presence fading from the human world until they fell completely into silence. Where did they go, and why did they leave? And perhaps most unsettling, the question to which all other questions point. What were they fleeing? What had found them before? What might find them again? What might already be finding them? What might have found us in their absence? These questions have no verified answers. They may never have answers in the sense that scholarship demands. Answers supported by evidence, verified across multiple sources, subjected to peer review and professional consensus. But in the quiet dark, as sleep approaches, and the boundaries of consciousness grow soft and permeable, these questions resonate with something older than scholarship, something more primal than professional methodology, something the ancient scribes, pressing cuneiform into wet clay, might have recognized and understood, even if they couldn't prove it either. Something was wrong in heaven. Something drove the gods down. Something frightened them, stolen technologies. We arrive now at the heart of the mystery, the question that has been gathering momentum since we began this journey together. And if your eyes have grown heavy, or if your thoughts have started to drift, that is perfectly fine, because some truths settle best into a mind that is not fully alert, a mind that has loosened its grip on the certainties of the day and allowed itself to wonder. The concept of the me in Sumerian. This word has troubled scholars for over a century to translate adequately, because it seems to mean something for which we have no single equivalent. The me are generally translated as divine decrees, or divine powers, or the fundamental principles that make civilization possible. But when you actually examine the surviving lists, when you read what the ancient scribes carefully catalogued as being the me that the goddess Inanna stole from the god Enki in one of the most famous tales of Mesopotamian literature, you encounter something far stranger than abstract principles. The lists include over 100 specific items, and they range from what you might expect, kingship, priesthood, the scribal arts, to things that seem curiously concrete. The throne of kingship, the exalted scepter, the staff, and then to categories that seem almost bizarre when placed alongside political powers. Things like the troubled heart, rejoicing the art of lovemaking, the kindling of strife, the pacifying of strife, the art of treachery, the art of straightforwardness, the plundering of cities, the setting up of lamentations, and crucially, for what we are exploring tonight, the descent into the underworld and the ascent from the underworld. These are not abstract concepts. Read them again in your mind. The descent into the underworld. The ascent from the underworld. These are procedures, techniques, methods for going somewhere and coming back. And they were considered so valuable, so essential, that Enki kept them locked away in the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the earth, his personal domain. And when Inanna came to visit him, got him drunk at a great feast, and persuaded him to give her the me one by one, he agreed in his intoxication. And when he sobered up and realized what he had done, he sent demon after demon to retrieve them. But Inanna escaped with her treasure and brought the me back to her city of Uruk. And the city became great because it now possessed what had been hidden. The standard scholarly interpretation is that this tale explains how civilization spread, how the arts and powers concentrated in one sacred place came to be distributed more widely. A mythological account of cultural diffusion. But consider the language, Consider the framing. This is not treated as a sharing of knowledge. It is treated as a theft. Enki is furious when he realizes what has happened. He sends supernatural forces to take back what was taken. The Mi are mentioned as objects that can be loaded onto a boat, just as Inanna loads them onto her boat of heaven and sails away with them. They have weight. They occupy space. They can be physically transported. And what if the Mi were not abstract principles, but actual technologies? What if they were the tools the Anunnaki had brought with them, the devices, techniques, and systems they needed to establish themselves quickly in a new world? To build civilization not over millennia of slow development, but within a few generations. And what if they were, more specifically, methods of protection and concealment? Exactly what beings fleeing something would need most desperately. The inclusion of the descent into the underworld and the ascent from the underworld becomes particularly suggestive in this light. These are not just spiritual concepts of death and return. In Mesopotamian thought, the underworld was a real place, a physical domain beneath the earth, where the dead went, but which could also be visited by the living under certain circumstances. Inanna herself descended into the underworld in another famous tale, and returned from it, albeit at a terrible price. If you were a being fleeing across the cosmos, if you needed hiding places, escape routes, methods for going somewhere no one could follow you, and coming back when it was safe to do so, wouldn't you value such techniques above almost anything else? Wouldn't you keep them secret, locked away, protected against theft? And if you were the goddess of a great city, and you learned that such techniques existed and were being hoarded by another deity, wouldn't you do almost anything to acquire them for yourself and your people? The Mi make perfect sense as a survival kit, a refugee kit, the accumulated knowledge of beings who had fled before and who knew what was necessary to establish a sanctuary, to create a functioning society quickly, to protect that society from whatever might come looking for it. And Enki, the god, who consistently sided with humanity, the god who warned Atrahasis of the flood, the god who oversaw the creation of humans and taught the first sages. Enki was the keeper of this toolkit. He was the one who knew how to survive. Let that thought settle as we turn to something even more controversial, something mainstream scholarship rejects entirely, but which persists in alternative interpretations of these texts with a stubbornness that suggests it might contain a grain of truth, even if the specific claims are exaggerated. Gold. The claim has been this, that the Anunnaki came to Earth specifically to mine gold, that they created humanity as a labor force for gold extraction, that the entire apparatus of early civilization was built around this single objective. This interpretation stems largely from the work of Zecharia Sitchin, whose translations and interpretations of Sumerian texts have been thoroughly debunked by professional Assyriologists. Let's be clear about that. The scientific consensus is that Sitchin mistranslated key terms, made connections the original texts do not support, and built an elaborate theory on a foundation of errors. And yet, the role of gold in Mesopotamian religion is striking even in standard scholarly accounts. The temples had to be gilded, not decorated with gold as an aesthetic choice, but obligated by religious law to be overlaid with gold. The cult statue of a god, the physical form in which the deity was believed to actually reside, was typically made of precious wood entirely covered in gold. The Ikur, Enlil's temple in Nippur, was called the House of the Mountain and was described in hymns as shining like the sun, blazing with gold. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib sacked Babylon in 689 BCE, he carried off as loot what ancient sources describe as tons of gold from the temples, gold that had accumulated over millennia of religious offerings. Why gold? The standard explanation is beauty, rarity, the way gold never tarnishes or corrodes, its association with the eternal and the divine precisely because it does not decay. All true. But consider gold from an engineering perspective, from the perspective of a spacefaring civilization, if we allow ourselves to entertain that possibility for a moment. Gold is an excellent conductor of electricity. Gold reflects infrared radiation with high efficiency. That is why it is used in the visors of astronaut helmets and in the heat shields of spacecraft. Gold is highly malleable and can be beaten into sheets thin enough to be almost transparent, while retaining its conductive and reflective properties. Gold is chemically inert, meaning it does not react with most other substances and does not corrode even over vast periods of time. If you were building something that needed to conduct energy, reflect radiation, resist degradation for millennia, and function in extreme environments, gold would be among the most useful materials available. And if you were building such things on a planet that had gold but lacked a labor force to extract it, you might indeed create such a labor force. This is speculation. Let us be absolutely clear on that. There is no text that explicitly states the Anunnaki needed gold for technological purposes. The alternative interpretation reads between the lines, connects dots that traditional scholars consider unconnected, builds a structure on foundations the academic establishment considers unsound. But the importance of gold in Mesopotamian religion, the absolute requirement that sacred spaces be painted or covered in it, the association of gold with divine flesh and divine presence. These are facts that mainstream scholarship confirms. The interpretation of these facts is where the disagreement lies. And as you lie there in the dark, as your breathing continues its slow rhythm, consider at least the possibility that gold served a function we no longer understand. That the blazing gold-leafed temples were not just beautiful, but operational in a way we have forgotten. That the obsessive accumulation of this particular metal in sacred contexts might preserve the memory of a purpose, even after the purpose itself was lost. We turn now to figures that mainstream archaeology acknowledges, though their full significance remains debated. The Apkallos, the seven sages, the teachers who came before the flood. In Mesopotamian tradition, 7 beings emerged from the sea in the earliest days of humanity and taught our ancestors the arts of civilization. They are depicted on the bas-reliefs of Assyrian palaces as strange hybrid creatures, half human and half fish, or sometimes as humans wearing fish cloaks, as if wearing the skin of their aquatic origin. Their names have survived in various lists. Uana, the first and greatest, who brought the plans for the temples and taught the rituals of worship, followed by Uanduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Enlilda, and Utuabzu, each teaching specific arts. The Greek name Oannes, recorded by the Babylonian priest Berosus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, is said to derive from Uana, and Berosus provides our most detailed account of what these beings taught. According to Berosus, Oannes emerged from the Persian Gulf when humans were still living like wild beasts, without law or civilization. This creature had the body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head was a human head, and beneath the fish's tail were human feet, and his voice was human and articulate. Oannes taught humans writing sciences, architecture, mathematics, agriculture, and all the arts that make civilized life possible. During the day, he taught humanity. At night, he returned to the sea. He ate no human food, and when his teaching was done, he disappeared and was never seen again, though other similar beings appeared after him to continue the work. The standard interpretation is that this is a mythologized memory of cultural contact, perhaps with a more advanced civilization from across the sea, perhaps with the region's earliest inhabitants, whose knowledge seemed miraculous to later peoples. The fish imagery might derive from the clothing of these teachers, perhaps fish skin garments common in coastal cultures, whose memory twisted over generations to become actual fish bodies. But notice the pattern. Teachers who arrive suddenly from elsewhere, bearing knowledge that transforms society, who teach urgently, intensively, as if racing against time, and who then leave or disappear before a great catastrophe. This pattern should be familiar to you by now. It echoes what we have seen in the accounts of the Anunnaki more broadly. Beings who come from elsewhere, who establish civilization, who then face a catastrophic flood, who survive, at least some of them, but who are changed, diminished, progressively, withdrawing from direct involvement with humanity. What if the Apkallos were the direct agents of this transmission? What if they were specifically tasked with preparing humanity as quickly as possible, because something was approaching, because there would be no time for slow, natural development, for the gradual accumulation of knowledge over millennia? The knowledge brought by the Apkallos was specific and urgent. Temple building, not just as architecture, but as a specific technical skill, with precise proportions and orientations. Purification rituals, which in Mesopotamian thought were not purely symbolic, but practically effective against spiritual and physical contamination. Incantations to ward off demons and disease. The reading of omens. The ability to see the signs of coming events in the movements of the stars, the livers of sheep, and the patterns of smoke and oil on water. This last category is particularly interesting. Divination, the art of reading the future, was not considered supernatural in the modern sense by the Mesopotamians. It was considered a technical skill, a science, a method of pattern recognition, detecting things that were actually there but required training to perceive. The gods had established correspondences between celestial events and earthly outcomes, and trained practitioners could read these correspondences and act accordingly. And what if the divination taught by the Apkallos was specifically an early warning system, a method for detecting the approach of whatever the Anunnaki feared? The ability to read the signs, to see the patterns, to know when danger was nearing in time to prepare or flee. The Apkallos didn't just teach humanity how to build a civilization, but how to protect it, how to purify sacred spaces, how to repel evil forces, how to read the signs of impending danger. And then they left their teaching finished, their task complete. They returned to wherever they came from, leaving humanity to face whatever was coming, with only the tools and the knowledge that had been passed down. Let's pause here for a moment. Let your body settle deeper into rest. Feel the weight of your limbs against the bed, the slow rhythm of your breathing, the darkness around you like a soft blanket. What we are contemplating tonight is vast. It spans periods of time that dwarf written history, across spaces that dwarf our planet. It asks questions that mainstream scholarship considers unanswerable and perhaps impossible to ask. You do not need to believe in any of this. The interpretations we are exploring are speculative, controversial, rejected by the academic establishment. The texts we are discussing are ancient, fragmentary, filtered through centuries of copying, translation, and interpretation. We cannot prove what we are suggesting. We can only notice patterns, ask questions, wonder what the ancient scribes were trying to preserve when they pressed their styluses into the wet clay and recorded stories of beings from elsewhere, of teachers from the sea, of floods that destroyed and survivors who rebuilt, of gods who withdrew and left humanity alone. The universe is vast beyond comprehension. In the time it takes light to travel from the nearest star other than our sun, civilizations could have risen and fallen 1,000 times. In the age of our galaxy, processes have unfolded that we cannot even imagine. We are very small, we know very little, and the darkness above us is filled with things we have never seen and may never see. The ancient peoples knew this darkness. They watched the stars with patient attention over generations, recording their movements, tracking their patterns, building monuments aligned with their rising and setting. They believed the sky was full of powers that shaped earthly events. They believed that what happened above was connected to what happened below. They believed they had been instructed, visited, shaped by beings from elsewhere. Were they simply wrong? Were they merely projecting their hopes and fears onto the cosmos, populating the dark with imaginary gods because they couldn't bear the emptiness? Perhaps, but perhaps they knew something we have forgotten. Perhaps they preserved in the only forms available to them memories of events so strange that later generations could only interpret them as mythology. The Sumerian word for the universe is Enki, literally heaven and earth. The word for the gods who rule this universe is Anunnaki, those of heaven and earth. Beings who belong to both realms, who move between them, who came from one to the other. And the flood. Let us finally speak directly of the flood. In the standard interpretations of the Mesopotamian flood narratives, the gods send the deluge to destroy humanity because humans have become too numerous, too noisy, disturbing the peace of the divine realm. Enlil, the chief god, is particularly irritated by the human uproar and convinces the divine council to vote for annihilation. Only Enki, always humanity's protector, defies the council and warns a single righteous man, variously named Ziusudra, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, depending on the version of the text, to build a boat and save himself, his family, and representatives of all animal life. The flood comes. The world is destroyed. The boat survives. The waters recede. The survivor makes a sacrifice. The gods, smelling the sweet smoke, gather around like flies. Suddenly aware of what they have done, suddenly hungry because there are no humans left to offer them food and worship. They regret their decision. They decide to allow humanity to continue, but with new limits, shorter lifespans, population control. The world begins again. It is a powerful narrative. It appears not only in Mesopotamia, but in cultures all over the world. Over 100 distinct flood traditions, according to some counts. From the biblical Noah, to the Hindu Manu, to the Greek Deucalion, to the Aztec Coxcox, to flood stories among the indigenous peoples of North America, South America, Australia, and Asia. The universality of this narrative is generally explained either as the memory of actual local floods, which are common human experiences, or as a psychological archetype, the fear of crushing water, speaking to something deep in the human unconscious. But consider another possibility. What if the flood wasn't sent by the Anunnaki? What if it was what finally caught up with them? Think about the oddities of the narrative. The gods create humanity to serve them. Almost immediately, they decide to destroy their creation. Why? The stated reason is noise, uproar, disturbance. But what kind of noise? What kind of disturbance? The texts use the word hubur, which can mean noise or clamor, but also tumult or din. What if it wasn't the sound of human voices and activity, but something else? A signal, a beacon, something that drew attention across vast distances, something that told whatever the Anunnaki were fleeing exactly where they were. And then Enki's disobedience. Why would a god defy the divine counsel? Why would he risk everything to save a single human family? In the standard reading, Enki is simply compassionate, unwilling to see his creation destroyed. But Enki is also the god of wisdom, of cunning, of long-term planning. What if he knew that whatever was coming would not be stopped by the flood? What if he knew that the Anunnaki's only hope was for humanity to survive, to have a population capable of continuing the work they had begun? The mining, the building, the maintenance of all the systems they had put in place. Saving Atrahasis wasn't sentimentality, it was strategy. And then the aftermath. The gods gathering like flies around the sacrifice, hungry, desperate, described in terms that seem entirely inappropriate for omnipotent deities. This image has puzzled scholars. Why would gods be hungry? Why would they need human sacrifices for sustenance? The usual explanation is that ancient peoples believed the gods were literally fed by the smoke of offerings. A theological concept that seems strange to modern minds. But what if the strangeness is the point? What if this description preserved the memory of beings who were not gods in the sense we understand, who actually needed something from humanity, who were genuinely weakened by the catastrophe and its aftermath? After the flood, everything changes. The Anunnaki impose new rules on humanity. Lifespans are drastically shortened. Where the antediluvian patriarchs lived for thousands of years, according to the king lists, the post-diluvian rulers live for hundreds, then tens of years, then normal human lifespans. Population growth is limited by various mechanisms, and most significantly, the gods begin to withdraw. In the antediluvian period, according to the king lists, the gods ruled directly. Kingship was in the hands of beings bearing divine names and having impossible reign lengths. After the flood, kingship comes down from heaven again, but now it is given to humans. The gods step back. They speak through dreams and omens. They dwell in the temples, but no longer walk among humanity. They become progressively more distant, more silent, more absent. By the time we reach historical periods, we can verify through multiple sources the gods are purely ceremonial presences mentioned in royal inscriptions, depicted on palace reliefs, but never appearing in flesh and blood, never intervening directly in human affairs. What happened? The standard explanation is theological evolution. As societies became more complex, concepts of divinity became more sophisticated. The crude anthropomorphism of early religion gave way to higher conceptions of divine transcendence. The gods withdrew because humanity no longer needed their physical presence. But what if this withdrawal was not a theological evolution, but a tactical necessity? What if the flood, or whatever the flood represents in these tales, was a narrow escape? What if the Anunnaki survived, but were forced to recognize that their presence, their visibility, their direct involvement with humanity put everyone in danger? What if they withdrew because they had to, because remaining visible meant being tracked, being found, having their location broadcast across whatever medium their pursuers used to hunt them? The post-flood world, described in the Mesopotamian texts, is a world where divine presence has diminished, where the gods speak only indirectly, where humanity is increasingly left to its own devices, while receiving periodic guidance through prophets and omens. This is not the behavior of triumphant deities savoring their victory. This is the behavior of survivors keeping a low profile, staying hidden, communicating through secure channels, because open communication is too dangerous. And what about the ziggurats, those massive step towers that dominated Mesopotamian cities? Structures like the famous Tower of Babel, which later traditions would interpret as human hubris, but which in their original context were temples, dwellings for the gods. The Sumerian name for these structures is Enuma, translated as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, or the house of the great light. They were believed to be the places where the gods descended from heaven to meet humanity, where the sacred marriage between divine and human took place, where heaven and earth connected. But they were also, according to some texts, gathering places, places where the Anunnaki assembled in council, points of contact between realms. And they were built on mountains, or in the flat plains of Mesopotamia, on artificial mountains, structures that raised the temple platform high above the surrounding lands. Why mountains? The standard explanation is that mountains were sacred in many ancient cultures, places where heaven and earth met, where the gods dwelt. But mountains also serve other functions: observation points, defensive positions, evacuation sites. When you need to see what's coming, when you need to be ready to leave quickly, when you need a place to gather before departure. If the ziggurats were departure points, gathering places for beings who might need to leave quickly, their design makes perfect sense. High enough to see in all directions, complex enough to house sacred objects and essential equipment, aligned to astronomical features that could serve as navigational aids. Connected, according to Mesopotamian belief, to both heaven and the underworld, to both potential destinations and potential escape routes. We don't know where the Anunnaki went. The texts describe their withdrawal, but not their final destination. Back to heaven, which in Mesopotamian cosmology could mean the atmospheric sky, the realm of the stars, the place from which they had originally descended, or perhaps deeper into the underworld, into the Abzu, into realms beneath the earth, where they might be harder to detect. Or perhaps they simply scattered as refugees do when their sanctuary is compromised, spreading out to make themselves harder to track, abandoning the concentrated presence that had made them vulnerable. The Sumerian king list continues after the flood through increasingly human dynasties, increasingly normal reign lengths. Until we emerge into historical time, we can verify through other sources. The list preserves a continuous tradition of governance, even as the nature of that governance changes entirely, as if the scribes wanted to maintain the chain, to show that whatever had been established at the beginning had not been broken, that the thread continued, even if the hands holding it had changed. But they also preserved in the impossible numbers of the early entries, in the strange tales of gods, floods, and divine withdrawal. The memory of something else, a time before, a presence that was gone, a reason for vigilance that might not be obvious to later generations, but which must not be forgotten. The question remains, what were they fleeing? What could frighten beings powerful enough to create a new species, wise enough to build civilizations, advanced enough to track the stars and encode their movements into the architecture of temples? What drove them from world to world until they arrived on Earth? What found them, even here, forcing the catastrophe remembered as the flood and the withdrawal that followed? The texts do not say directly, but they hint. They point to something in the darkness between the stars, something that follows, something that hunts, something that the Anunnaki, for all their power, could not defeat, but only flee. And in their flight, they created us. In their desperation, they created a servant species to help them prepare their defenses. And in their partial defeat, they withdrew, leaving us fragments of their knowledge, the ruins of their structures, and myths that encode warnings we are still trying to understand. As you sink deeper into rest, let these images settle like sediment in calm water. The tablets in their museum case, still keeping their secrets. The ziggurats crumbling on the plains of Iraq, their bricks slowly returning to the earth from which they were made. The stars wheeling overhead, those same stars the ancient astronomers tracked with such meticulous attention, looking for signs, watching for the return of what they had been taught to fear. You do not need to believe. You only need to wonder to entertain the possibility that the stories preserved in our oldest texts might be more than primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, that they might contain, encoded in the language and concepts available to pre-scientific peoples, the memories of events too strange, too vast, too terrible to be recorded any other way. The Anunnaki, if they existed, if they were beings and not merely mythological constructs, knew something we do not. They feared something we have forgotten to fear. They prepared against something that might still be out there in the dark, waiting, watching, tracking the signals of civilization wherever they appear. And humanity, their creation, their servants, their children, in a strange sense. We continue, we build, we ask questions, we look up at the stars and wonder, what is looking back? We preserve the old stories without fully understanding them, copying the tablets generation after generation, sensing that something important is encoded there, even when we can't quite say what it is. The cycle continues, the pattern holds. And somewhere in archives we haven't found yet, in languages we can't yet read, in monuments whose purpose we can't yet guess, the answers are waiting. Patient as clay, silent as the space between the stars, ready to be discovered by those with the eyes to see and the courage to understand the silent sentinels. Let us turn now to what is perhaps the strangest part of this ancient mystery. Not what the Anunnaki did while they were here, nor even what drove them away, but what they might have left behind, the traces of a presence that linger long after departure, the systems that continue to function when their creators are gone, the watchers who remain at their posts even when there is no one left to report to. If the Anunnaki truly fled the earth, if they withdrew from all direct involvement in human affairs after the flood, as the texts consistently suggest, we would not necessarily expect a complete absence, a total silence, an absolute abandonment. beings sophisticated enough to create a new species, to lay the foundations of civilization, to encode astronomical knowledge into architecture and myth. Such beings would likely have had contingency plans. Would they have left behind surveillance systems? Would they have wanted to know what happened after they left? If the threat followed them, if it was safe to return, if their creation survived or perished, and if it might one day be useful again. And when we examine the mythological and spiritual traditions that emerged in the millennia following the decline of Sumerian civilization, we find something curious, something that doesn't quite fit the standard narrative of religious evolution from polytheism to monotheism to secular rationalism. We find watchers. The concept appears so consistently across cultures and eras that it demands closer attention. In Mesopotamian tradition, every human being was believed to be accompanied by personal protective spirits, the Lamassu and the Shedu, beings depicted as winged, human-headed bulls or lions, whose massive statues guarded the entrances of Assyrian palaces. But these monumental sculptures were only the visible representation of something more intimate. It was thought that every person had their own guardian, an assigned watcher, who accompanied them throughout their life, who observed their actions, and who would ultimately testify to their conduct. The function of these beings is significant. They didn't primarily intervene. They didn't constantly perform miracles, grant wishes, or change the course of events. Their main function was observation. They watched, they recorded, they remembered. In the Book of Enoch, that curious Jewish apocalyptic text, excluded from most biblical canons but preserved by the Ethiopian Church, we encounter the Watchers directly, a class of angelic beings whose very name defines their purpose. Enochic tradition tells us that Watchers descended to earth in ancient times, that they taught forbidden knowledge to humanity, that they overstepped boundaries by taking human wives, and that they were ultimately punished for their transgression. But notice what remains. Even after their punishment, the concept of surveillance persists. The heavens still contain observers. The recording of human actions continues. Someone, or something, maintains the watch, even after the fall of the original Watchers. Islamic tradition preserves a similar concept. The Kiraman Katibin, the noble scribes, two angels assigned to every human being, one recording good deeds, the other bad. Their ledgers to be presented at judgment. And again, the function is observation and record-keeping, not constant intervention. The angels watch, they write. They store information for a future accounting. In Catholic tradition, guardian angels serve a similar purpose. Every soul is assigned a celestial protector who observes, guides subtly, but generally does not intervene dramatically in the course of events. The Zoroastrian tradition speaks of the Fravashis, spiritual beings who watch over the living and can be called upon for protection. The Hindu tradition describes various classes of celestial beings who observe the accumulation of human karma. The pattern is global. The pattern is persistent. The pattern suggests something deeper than simple cultural borrowing or psychological projection. But consider what this pattern implies. If we take seriously the possibility that the Anunnaki were real beings who left surveillance systems behind, you would want to know what happened after your departure. You would want to know if the threat you fled finally arrived, if your creation survived, if it developed as planned, if it might one day be useful again. You might assign watchers, whether technological systems, loyal subordinates, or a combination we can barely imagine, to maintain observation, to record events, to preserve information that could be retrieved later. And if these watchers had been functioning for thousands of years, if they had woven themselves into human spiritual experience through millennia of subtle presence, they would appear in our religious traditions exactly as they do. They would appear as observers, as scribes, as beings who keep watch without constantly intervening, who watch and wait for something, who will one day report back to a higher authority. This is proof of nothing. It is pattern recognition. It is noting that the mythological footprint matches what we would expect if the speculative interpretation we have been developing held any validity. The watchers might be purely psychological constructs, projections of the human feeling of being observed, manifestations of conscience externalized into spiritual beings. That explanation satisfies many scholars, and it may well be correct. But it doesn't quite account for the consistency, the specificity, the functional similarity across cultures that had no contact with one another. Why would isolated cultures independently develop the exact same concept of assigned observers, who record but rarely intervene, who watch and wait for something, who will one day report to a higher authority? Unless they were all experiencing in their own ways the same underlying reality. Unless something is actually watching us. Unless the watchers are real. Let your eyes rest closed now if they aren't already. Feel the weight of the blankets over your body, the support of the mattress beneath you, the darkness surrounding you, like the darkness between the stars. Vast and quiet and patient. What we have been discussing is ancient, incredibly old, separated from us by millennia of human generations. And yet somehow it doesn't feel entirely distant, does it? There is something in these stories that resonates with experiences we still have. The feeling of being watched when no one is visible. The intuition that our actions matter to something beyond ourselves. The persistent human conviction that we are not entirely alone in the universe, even when we feel most isolated. Whether this represents a true perception of spiritual reality, a psychological projection, or an ancestral memory of beings who once walked among us and left systems behind to continue observing after they were gone. Something in the human soul responds to the concept of the watchers with recognition rather than confusion. We know what it means to be watched. We feel it happening, even when we cannot identify the observers. Now let us turn away from the watchers themselves to consider what they might have been watching over. The structures that ancient peoples built with such care, precision, and effort. Structures that have baffled archaeologists, engineers, and historians for centuries. Structures we interpret as temples, tombs, and astronomical observatories, but which might have had functions we haven't yet imagined, because we don't know what they were designed to protect us against. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia rise from the floodplains of Iraq like artificial mountains, step pyramids, climbing toward the heavens, each level smaller than the one below, crowned with a temple at the summit, where the god was believed to descend to meet the priests. We call them temples, and they certainly functioned as temples, as centers of religious practice, political power, and economic administration. But consider their shape. Consider the resources required to build them. Consider the precision with which they were oriented and proportioned. The great ziggurat of Ur, partially restored in the 20th century, originally stood over 100 feet tall, built with millions of mud bricks, its corners aligned precisely to the cardinal directions. The manpower required to construct such a structure in an era before metal tools, wheeled vehicles, and modern construction equipment was staggering. Tens of thousands of workers, over years or decades, brick by brick, level by level, raising an artificial mountain on flat ground. Why? The standard explanation is religious devotion, the desire to create a meeting place between heaven and earth, a physical representation of cosmic connection. And this explanation is almost certainly partly correct. But it doesn't quite account for the precision, the alignment, the specific proportions that appear again and again across different ziggurat sites. It doesn't explain why this particular shape, the step pyramid, became the mandatory format. Why couldn't temples simply be built at ground level or on natural hills? Why was such a colossal effort invested in creating artificial elevation? Consider now the pyramids of Egypt, separated from Mesopotamia by hundreds of miles and significant cultural differences, yet exhibiting the same fundamental shape, the stepped structure rising toward the sky, the precise alignments to astronomical phenomena, the massive investment in labor and resources. The Great Pyramid of Giza required an estimated 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing tons, quarried, transported, lifted, and fitted together with a precision that modern engineers find remarkable. For what purpose? To house the body of a pharaoh. The burial chamber inside the Great Pyramid is relatively small and austere compared to later Egyptian tombs. No treasure was found there, no elaborate funerary furnishings, no clear evidence it was ever actually used as a tomb. The sarcophagus in the king's chamber appears to have been built into the structure rather than inserted after construction, as if the chamber's purpose was not to receive a body later, but to contain something from the very beginning. The shafts extending from the chambers toward the outside of the pyramid, initially thought to be for ventilation, align precisely with specific stars as they appeared in the sky during the pyramid's construction. Why would a tomb need ventilation? Why would the dead need a view of Orion and Sirius? Unless the pyramid was not primarily a tomb, unless its functions included something we haven't yet understood. Consider the global pattern of step pyramids. In Mesoamerica, the great temple pyramids of the Maya and the Aztecs aligned to astronomical events built with mathematical precision, requiring enormous investments of labor from societies that possessed neither metal tools, nor wheeled vehicles, nor beasts of burden. The mounds across North America, some of them massive earthworks, containing millions of cubic yards of soil moved by hand, basket by basket, oriented toward celestial phenomena with remarkable accuracy. Step temples in Indonesia, in China, in Cambodia, the same basic shape appearing independently in cultures that had no contact with one another, as if they were all following the same blueprint, as if they had all received the same instructions. The standard explanation is convergent evolution, that the pyramid shape is structurally stable and naturally suggests itself to anyone building large structures without modern engineering. That astronomical alignment reflects the universal human interest in the sky, that the similarities are coincidences. And this explanation might be correct. The pyramid is indeed a stable shape. Humans worldwide do watch the sky. Independent inventions do happen, but the precision disrupts this explanation. The mathematical relationships encoded in these structures suggest a sophistication beyond what we generally attribute to their builders. The resources invested suggest an importance beyond what we can explain by religious devotion alone. Something else was going on, something we don't fully understand because we don't know what these structures were meant to do. And what if they weren't monuments at all? What if they were machines? Not machines in the modern sense of gears, motors, and electricity, but machines nonetheless. Devices designed to accomplish specific purposes through their shapes, their materials, and their locations. And what if the precise alignments weren't symbolic gestures toward the cosmos, but functional requirements calibrations necessary for the structures to operate? And what if the gold that decorated the temples, covered the pyramidions, and lined the sacred chambers wasn't mere ornamentation, but an essential component selected for its specific material properties? Its conductivity, its incorruptibility, its resonance. And what if the pyramids, the ziggurats, the stone circles, and the mounds were protective devices, shields against something, guardians maintaining a barrier we no longer perceive because we don't know what they were meant to protect us against? This is speculation, pure speculation, unsupported by any evidence that mainstream archaeology would accept. But it is speculation that accounts for the pattern that explains why such massive resources were invested. It makes sense of the precision, the alignment, and the global distribution. If you were fleeing something, if you were establishing a refuge on a new world, if you needed to protect that refuge against eventual discovery, you might build exactly what we see scattered across the ancient world. Structures oriented toward the cosmos, because the threat came from the cosmos. Structures built with specific materials, because those materials served specific functions. Structures requiring massive labor, because planetary-scale protection requires massive infrastructure. And you might encode into myth and scripture the knowledge needed to maintain those structures, the rituals that kept them active, the alignments that had to be honored, the proportions that could not be altered, disguising technical requirements as religious obligations, so that even after the original knowledge was lost, the protective systems would continue to function through the blind devotion of populations who no longer understood what they were actually doing. Let these ideas drift now, like clouds in the night sky, present but not demanding attention. Shapes forming, dissolving, and reforming in the darkness behind your eyelids. Your breathing has grown deeper, slower. The rhythm of approaching sleep, the body preparing to let go of the day and cross into the vast country of dreams. What we are considering tonight does not require belief. It requires only consideration, only the willingness to entertain possibilities that mainstream scholarship rejects, only the recognition that the ancient world holds mysteries we have not yet solved and may never fully solve. The structures remain, the alignments persist. The watchers, if they exist, continue their guard. And we, the descendants of whatever happened in those deep times, go about our lives mostly unaware of the patterns around us. The ancient infrastructure we move through without seeing the warnings encoded in traditions we have forgotten how to read. We must now speak of the warnings themselves, the messages the ancient peoples seemed so desperate to preserve, the prophetic and eschatological elements woven into their myths, their scriptures, and their astronomical records. For if beings fleeing a cosmic threat arrived on Earth, established a civilization, created humanity to assist in their labors, and then left, or were destroyed when the threat finally caught up to them, they would highly likely try to warn us. They would try to encode information about what had happened and what might happen again. They would try to give their creation a chance at survival even after their own demise. And when we look at the ancient records with this possibility in mind, we find exactly what we would expect. Warnings we have read as mythology, because we lacked the context to understand them literally. Mesopotamian texts contain numerous references to cycles completing, to ages ending, to cosmic patterns repeating. The concept of the Great Year, a cycle of roughly 26,000 years, corresponding to the precession of the equinoxes, appears in Mesopotamian astronomical records, along with suggestions that cosmic events correlate with positions in this cycle. The Hindu tradition speaks explicitly of the Kali Yuga ending in catastrophic destruction before a new golden age can begin, and calculates specific time frames for when this transition will occur. The Mayan long count calendar tracked cycles of about 5,000 years, the completion of each cycle being associated with transformative cosmic events. The Hopi traditions speak of previous worlds destroyed and current worlds destined for a similar fate. The Norse traditions describe Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, as an approaching, inevitable doom. The pattern is global. The pattern is specific. The pattern suggests not a vague anxiety about mortality, but a precise knowledge of cycles of timing, of events that recur at predictable intervals. Were the ancient scribes recording prophecies received from divine sources? Were they extrapolating from patterns they had observed, projecting cycles forward to predict that what had happened before would happen again? Or were they preserving information handed down to them by beings who had already experienced these cycles, who knew by direct observation what happened at certain points in cosmic time, who wanted their creation to be prepared even if that preparation might prove futile? The narratives of return further complicate this question. Across cultures, we find the motif of departed gods who promised to come back, or whose return was predicted, or whose return was feared. The Aztecs waiting for Quetzalcoatl to return from the east, an expectation Cortés exploited during his conquest. The cargo cults in the Pacific, expecting divine beings to return bearing gifts. Various Christian traditions anticipating the second coming. Various Jewish traditions anticipating the Messiah. The Zoroastrian tradition awaiting the Seoshyant. The Buddhist tradition awaiting Maitreya. Again and again, the gods who left are expected to return. But here is what unsettles the standard interpretation. This return is not uniformly seen as positive. In many traditions, the return is associated with judgment, with destruction, with the end of the current age, with a catastrophe that precedes renewal. The returning gods will not simply resume their benevolent oversight. They will bring a transformation that few will survive. And what if these tales of return weren't spiritual metaphors for hope and redemption? What if they were warnings, encoded predictions about the completion of cycles, about the expiration of orbital periods, about whatever chased the Anunnaki finally resurfacing to check if its prey had actually escaped? Take a slow breath now. Feel the weight of your body settling deeper into rest. These questions have no certain answers. Not tonight, perhaps not ever. The ancient world guards its secrets well. Tablets crumble, stones erode, languages die, and must be painstakingly reconstructed by scholars working with fragments. What survives is a fraction of what was written, and what was written was a fraction of what was known. And what was known was perhaps only a fraction of what actually happened. We are working at the very end of a very long chain of transmission, trying to hear whispers that have crossed thousands of years, dozens of cultures, and countless acts of translation, interpretation, and misunderstanding. Perhaps we are only hearing our own echoes. Perhaps the patterns we perceive are patterns we project. The tendency of the human mind to find meaning in random noise, to connect dots that are not actually connected. Or perhaps there really is something there. Perhaps the warnings are real. Perhaps the cycles continue. Perhaps the watchers are still watching. The structures are still functioning, and the return is still approaching. We cannot know. We can only wonder. We can only notice the patterns, consider the possibilities, and hold the questions for those who will come after us. Consider now what this means for our own moment in history, for the civilization we have built, for the choices we face about what to preserve and what to let go. If the story of the Anunnaki teaches us anything, whether read literally or mythologically, it is that civilizations eventually fade, that beings more powerful than us, wiser, more technologically advanced, could not escape the cycles that govern the cosmos, that whatever refuge they built, whatever protections they established, whatever warnings they encoded, something finally caught up to them, and they left, or were destroyed, and only traces remain. This is not a message of despair. It is a message of humility. It is a reminder that nothing is permanent, that the greatest achievements eventually crumble, that the mightiest empires eventually fall, that even the gods eventually fade into mythology, and then into fragments of text that scholars decipher in museums. But within this impermanence, there is also persistence. The Anunnaki, if they existed, are gone. But we are still here. The species they created, the civilization they founded, the knowledge they passed on, all of it continued after they left. We are the proof that something can survive the cycle, that the creation can outlast the creator, that the torch can be passed even when the hands that lit it have vanished into the dark. The chain of transmission from ancient Sumer to our own time is remarkable when you trace it carefully. Sumerian script gave way to Akkadian, then to Babylonian and Assyrian. Cuneiform writing adapted to different languages for millennia. When Babylon fell to Persia, some of the knowledge was transferred into new imperial contexts. Greek scholars traveling to the Near East encountered astronomical and mathematical knowledge that influenced the development of their own sciences. The Library of Alexandria gathered texts from across the ancient world, including Mesopotamian sources. When the library was destroyed and scattered, some of its knowledge seeped into Islamic scholarship, preserved and expanded during the centuries when European learning contracted. Eventually, through translations, transfers, and scholarly reconnections, ancient knowledge began to flow back into European consciousness, culminating in the decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century, which finally allowed us to read what the Sumerians had written 4,000 years earlier. And here we are tonight, you lying in the dark, and me speaking to your drifting consciousness, contemplating texts that scribes pressed into clay in the time of Hammurabi. Texts that were already ancient when Hammurabi lived. Texts that claim to preserve knowledge from even before the flood. From the antediluvian era, when gods walked openly among mortals and kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, something survived through all the catastrophes, all the collapses, all the auto-da-fés, all the library burnings, and all the cultural erasures. Something made it through. We do not possess everything the ancients knew. We have fragments, clues, pieces of a puzzle we may never be able to fully assemble, but we have something. And the fact that we have anything at all suggests that preservation is possible, that knowledge can persist across gulfs that seem uncrossable, that what we encode today might survive for recipients we cannot even imagine. This brings us to the question we must ask ourselves. Are we the 7th civilization, the 8th, or the 100th? We who do not know our position in the cycle, but suspect we are not the first. What are we preserving? What are we encoding for those who will dig through our ruins, who will wonder at our artifacts, who will try to understand what we knew, what we feared, and what we hoped? Our digital archives, so vast and exhaustive, depend on an infrastructure that could collapse tomorrow. A large enough solar flare, a widespread enough war, a devastating enough epidemic, and the servers go dark. The hard drives spin down, and the billions of texts, images, and videos we have accumulated become inaccessible within a single generation. The digital age, with all its marvels, is built on sand. What we must preserve most carefully may need to be kept on older mediums, on stone, ceramic, and metal, in forms that do not require electricity or specialized readers, through methods the ancients understood and we have largely forgotten. We have inherited the ancient world far more than we usually recognize. 60 seconds in a minute, because the Babylonians used base 60 mathematics. 60 minutes in an hour for the same reason. 24 hours in a day, a convention tracing back to the Egyptian division of daylight and darkness, 360 degrees in a circle. Another legacy of base 60. 7 days in a week, corresponding to the 7 classical planets visible to the naked eye. A Mesopotamian convention that spread across the globe and persists today in cultures that have no memory of its origin. 12 months in a year, 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 hours of day and 12 of night. Another echo of Mesopotamian astronomical organization. We count and measure using systems that dead civilizations devised. Systems so fundamental to our daily experience that we forget they are conventional. We forget that someone had to invent them. We forget that they represent knowledge handed down from a very distant past. If the Anunnaki established these systems, if the Me Inanna stole included not only abstract concepts, but concrete techniques for organizing time, space, and measurement, then we are still using their technology every time we check our watches. We are still operating within their framework every time we navigate by compass directions, calculate angles, or divide the day. The legacy is so total, so pervasive, so invisible, that we take it for natural law rather than cultural invention. 60 minutes in an hour is not a fact of physics. It is a convention, a choice, an inherited technology we keep because changing it would be inconvenient, because it works well enough, because we have forgotten there are alternatives. What else might we be maintaining without understanding it? What other systems established in deep antiquity might still be running? Their original purposes lost their upkeep, disguised as religious observances, cultural traditions, or simple habit. The Anunnaki, if they existed, encoded survival knowledge into formats designed to persist through collapse forgetting and millennia of cultural change. We may still be running their programs without knowing it, still operating on ancient software we mistake for human nature. Your consciousness is drifting now. I can feel it in the rhythm of these words, in the way they seem to come from further and further away, in the way meaning dissolves into sound, and sound dissolves into silence, and silence dissolves into the deep quiet of approaching sleep. What we have discussed tonight requires no resolution. The mysteries remain mysterious. The questions remain questions. The patterns we have traced through ancient texts, world mythologies, and megalithic architecture may mean everything, or they may mean nothing at all. They may be actual evidence of the existence of beings who came and left their mark. Or they may be the elaborate productions of the human imagination, trying to make sense of a cosmos that offers no explanations, no guarantees, no answers to our deepest questions about our origins, why we are here, and what might happen next. But consider this as you drift. Consider this as the last thoughts of waking consciousness fade into the strange logic of dreams. The ancient scribes who pressed their styluses into clay, who recorded the king lists, the creation myths, and the astronomical tables, believed they were preserving something important. They didn't know who would read their tablets, didn't know that their cities would crumble, their languages would die, and millennia would pass before anyone could understand their words again. But they wrote anyway. They preserved anyway. They believed that somehow, across gulfs they could not even imagine, someone would receive what they were passing down. Someone would decipher their signs, eventually decode the meaning, and learn what they had tried so hard to preserve. And they were right. We are here. We are reading. We are wondering what they knew, what they feared, and what they hoped we would understand. The chain continues. Whatever broke them, whatever ended their civilization, whatever made the Anunnaki flee and left humanity alone to develop however it could. It did not break the chain entirely. Something made it through. And something will make it through from us. Even if our civilization ends tomorrow, even if the servers go dark, if the books burn, and if the languages we speak become as dead as Sumerian, something will persist. Future archaeologists will dig through our ruins, find our artifacts, and wonder what we knew, what we feared, what we hoped. They would understand the pattern continues. The cycle turns. The watchers, if they exist, continue their guard. The warnings, if they are real, wait to be fully decoded. And we, the current bearers of a torch that has passed through countless hands over countless millennia, we carry it as best we can into a darkness we cannot illuminate, toward recipients we do not know, trusting that this preservation matters even when we don't see how, trusting that the chain will continue even after we have let go of our link. Sleep now. Let the ancient world recede into the distance of deep time. Let the ziggurats, the pyramids, and the stone circles stand their silent guard without your consciousness to observe them. Let the tablets rest in their museum cases, their messages delivered, their warnings as clear as they will ever be to minds living in contexts so different from those that created them. Let the Anunnaki, whoever they were, keep their secrets a little longer. The mysteries will still be there when you wake. The questions will still be waiting. The patterns will continue, whether we perceive them or not. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, in the incomprehensible distances, separating one world from another, and one epoch from another, whatever the Anunnaki fled might still be moving, long since dissipated, or perhaps never having existed at all, except in the fears and stories of beings who needed to explain why they felt so alone in the cosmos, why the gods had withdrawn, why the golden age had ended, why we must struggle, suffer, and die, when the texts speak of times when things were different, when powers walked openly upon the earth, when lifespans were measured in thousands of years rather than mere decades. Perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all. Not what chased the Anunnaki away, but why we feel in our very bones that something is missing, that we are orphans in the cosmos, that somewhere once we belonged to something vaster. We knew something more. We lived in connection with powers and designs we can no longer quite remember. The myths might be memories. The warnings might be real. The watchers might still be watching. Or all of it might just be the beautiful, necessary fiction that conscious beings create to make sense of existence in a cosmos that offers none. We cannot know. We can only wonder. We can only preserve what we can pass on, what we have received, and trust that the chain will continue. Good night, sweet dreams. And if the watchers are observing your sleeping form, perhaps they note with a kind of satisfaction that the project continues, that the creation still creates, that the purpose that brought them here so long ago hasn't entirely failed, that we, the children of their emergency, the product of their desperate need, have become something more than they intended, something capable of wondering about its own origins, something capable of asking questions they perhaps hoped we would never think to ask. Sleep now. The questions will wait. The mysteries remain, and the long night of deep time continues its slow, patient rotation toward the dawn that will eventually break. The whispers of the clay. Let us return now to where we began. In that quiet museum gallery, where the fluorescent lights hum softly overhead, where the glass cases house the fragments of worlds that no longer exist, to that small clay tablet resting on its pedestal. Those cuneiform impressions pressed into mud that has survived 4,000 years of empires rising and falling, of languages being born and dying, of countless generations living their entire lives without even knowing these marks existed. And yet they remain there, silent and patient, waiting for someone to finally understand what they hold. And perhaps you see them differently now than you did at the beginning of our journey. Perhaps what seemed to be nothing but religious mythology now carries a different weight, a different texture. Because you have followed the thread through creation accounts and cosmic battles through flood stories and divine departures, through patterns that repeat across cultures that should have had no contact with one another. And the tablet no longer looks like a mere artifact of a dead civilization, but rather like a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean of time by someone who desperately wanted future generations to know something, to understand something, to be warned about something. And the scribe who carved those marks into the wet clay millennia ago may not have fully understood what he was recording. He may have been copying texts even older than his own ancient civilization, texts whose original meaning had already begun to fade into the comfortable obscurity of mythology. But they preserved them anyway, because something in them recognized that this mattered, that it was true, in a way that transcended literal interpretation, that future generations would need this knowledge, even if the scribe himself couldn't articulate exactly why. And so they pressed the stylus into the clay with meticulous precision, creating each cuneiform impression with the reverence that sacred work demands. And then the tablet was baked, stored, copied, and recopied across the centuries, surviving the fall of Sumer, the rise of Babylon, the conquests of Assyria, the burning of libraries, and its slow burial beneath the desert sand, until it finally emerged, blinking into the modern world, where scholars cataloged it, translated it, and filed it away as mythology, as primitive religion, as the quaint beliefs of peoples who didn't yet understand how the world really works. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps it is only mythology, only the imaginative constructs of ancient minds trying to make sense of a confusing and frightening world. But perhaps not. Perhaps the patterns we have traced tonight point toward something real, something the ancient scribes understood in a way we have forgotten. Something encoded in the stories, because stories survive when everything else crumbles. And the central question remains suspended in the dark, like a star whose light has traveled unimaginable distances to reach us. What chased the Anunnaki from every planet where they settled? What drove divine beings to flee across the cosmos and arrive on Earth as refugees rather than conquerors? What made them desperate enough to create an entirely new species just to have workers for their survival efforts? What followed them here and forced them to encode warnings into architecture, mythology, and astronomical records? What finally caught up to them and triggered the catastrophic flood that nearly destroyed everything they had built? And where did they go afterward? Will whatever was chasing them return? We do not know. We may never know. The answer might be encoded in texts we can read, but cannot truly comprehend because we lack the context that would make their meaning clear. Or it might be preserved on tablets that haven't yet been discovered, still buried beneath the sands of Iraq, or submerged beneath the waters that rose when the Ice Age ended. Or perhaps it was passed down orally through generations of priests and initiates, until the chain of transmission finally broke and the knowledge was lost, scattered like seeds fallen on stone, unable to take root. And perhaps the answer doesn't matter. Perhaps what matters is the question itself, because asking it changes how we perceive ourselves and our place in the cosmos. Asking it opens the possibility that the history of humanity is not the triumphant march of progress we were taught, but rather a chapter in a much longer and much stranger story. A story that began before us and will continue after us. A story in which we are not the protagonists, but simply the heirs to a legacy we don't fully understand, and the recognition of a threat beyond our current comprehension. A threat that the most sophisticated beings in our mythological records found terrifying enough to flee repeatedly, might be the first step toward the kind of wisdom that allows civilizations to survive. Not the arrogant wisdom that claims we understand everything, but the humble wisdom that acknowledges all we do not know and prepares accordingly. And your breathing has settled now. Your body has grown heavy against the mattress. The darkness around you has become soft and welcoming rather than empty and cold. And you can feel the boundary between waking and sleeping beginning to thin. That liminal space where thoughts drift, dissolve, and reform into something that is not quite a memory and not quite a dream. I invite you now to let go, to surrender the questions, the evidence, and the patterns to that deeper part of your mind where they can settle and transform. Let the images of tonight drift through your consciousness like leaves on a quiet river. The ancient cities rising from the dust with their ziggurats pointing toward the sky. Or perhaps reaching toward something that once descended from the sky and might descend again. The beings falling from heaven with their divine knowledge and their divine fear, building and teaching, worrying and scanning the horizon for signs of what they knew must inevitably come. The scribes in their temple schools, copying texts they only half understood, because something in them recognized the importance of preservation. The floodwaters rising, falling, and rising again over geological time, reshaping coastlines, drowning civilizations, leaving nothing but fragments behind. The patterns repeating, culture after culture. The same stories told in different languages. The same warnings encoded in different symbols, as if humanity were continually trying to remember something crucial that keeps slipping away. Let yourself sink into these images. Let them become the landscape of your dreams. Tonight, you don't need to analyze them, nor understand them, nor remember them precisely. They will do their work in the deeper layers of your consciousness, where meaning is felt rather than thought, where truth is recognized by resonance rather than by logic. And perhaps tonight you will dream of the ancient world of Eridu rising from the marshes, like the first city, of priests in linen, performing rituals whose original purpose has long been forgotten, of astronomers on the platforms of the ziggurats, tracking the stars, the planets, and something else that moved across the heavens on a cycle too long to be observed in a single human lifetime. Or perhaps you will dream of the flood of water rising at an impossible speed, of a boat riding waves that shouldn't exist, of a world washed and purified while something immense moves beneath the surface. Or perhaps you will dream of the departure of beings gathering on a sacred mound for the last time, of a decision made to withdraw, to hide, to leave their creation, to carry alone whatever could be carried into the future. Or perhaps you will dream of nothing in particular, just the formless dark of deep sleep, where the body heals, the mind assimilates, and time loses all meaning. And any of these dreams would be fitting. Any of these dreams would be a perfect end to our journey tonight. Because what matters is not the specific content of your dreams, but the quality of the rest those dreams provide. The restoration that comes when we allow consciousness to dissolve for a few hours into the great mystery from which it emerged. And as you drift, I want to offer you one final meditation, one last thought to take with you into sleep. It is simply this: you are part of something vast, ancient, and enduring, something that began long before your birth and will continue long after you are gone, something that connects you to every human being who has ever lived, and to every human who ever will live. A chain of consciousness, of culture, and of accumulated wisdom, stretching from the original beginning to the final end. And it doesn't matter if the Anunnaki were real beings fleeing an inconceivable threat across the cosmos. It doesn't matter if they were mythological constructs encoding psychological and spiritual truths that the human mind needed to externalize in order to process. Or it doesn't matter if they were something in between, something for which we don't yet have the conceptual framework to understand properly. The message encoded in their stories remains. Pay attention to the world around you. Notice the patterns that repeat across history, mythology, and nature. Preserve what matters most, because catastrophe eventually strikes every civilization, and only what is carefully preserved has a chance of surviving. Prepare for threats you cannot fully anticipate by building resilience, redundancy, and humility into your systems. And always remember that you are not alone. You are not the first to face uncertainty and fear, nor the last to wonder what lies beyond the edges of the known. You are part of a continuous thread of human experience that weaves through time like a river, flowing sometimes to the surface and sometimes disappearing into caverns to emerge miles away. Changed, but continuous. And the scribes of antiquity, pressing cuneiform into clay, were part of that thread. And the monks of the Middle Ages, copying manuscripts by candlelight, were part of that thread. And the librarians, the archivists, the teachers, and the parents who pass knowledge to each new generation are part of that thread. And you are part of that thread, receiving what has been handed down to you and passing it on in turn, in whatever form it takes. And that is enough. That is enough meaning. That is enough purpose. To be a link in a chain you did not forge and which you will not complete. Carry forward all the fragments of wisdom, beauty, and truth you can gather. Preserve what you can preserve. Transmit what you can transmit. And trust that those who come after will do the same. And somewhere in a museum, in London, in Berlin, in Baghdad, or in Philadelphia, a clay tablet rests in its climate-controlled case. Its cuneiform script still legible after 4,000 years. Its message still waiting to be fully understood. And perhaps one day, someone will read it with the right eyes, the right preparation, the right questions already formed in their mind. And they will finally decipher what the ancient scribes were trying to tell us. They will finally understand what chased the Anunnaki across the stars. And if that entity is still out there, still following them, still looking for what it has always sought. And perhaps that person will be you in a distant future, in a future life, in a future rotation of the great wheel. Or perhaps the message will never be completely decoded, and the question will remain open forever. A mystery preserved in clay, a warning we couldn't quite manage to hear, a truth we couldn't manage to grasp. And perhaps that too is acceptable. Perhaps some questions are meant to remain unanswered, meant to keep us humble, meant to remind us that the universe is vaster, stranger, and older than we could ever imagine. And on that thought, I release you into sleep, into the darkness that waits patiently every night to receive consciousness and hold it gently until morning, into the dreams that will come or will not come according to their own mysterious logic, into the deep rest that your body and your mind require to continue functioning in this world, as strange as it is beautiful. And the tablet waits in its case, and the stars wheel above us in the patterns the ancient astronomers knew. And the patterns continue, and the cycles turn, and somewhere in the spaces between what we know and what we do not know, the story continues to unfold. The story that began before us and will continue after us. The story we are all part of, whether we understand it or not. And tomorrow you will wake up and you will continue your own small part of the story, carrying forward what you must carry, preserving what you must preserve, passing on what you must pass on. And tonight you will sleep, you will dream, you will rest, and you will be caught up in that darkness that embraces us all. The darkness that held the ancient scribes and the divine beings they wrote about, and all the generations in between. The darkness that is not empty, but full, full of all that has been and all that will be. Full of questions, answers, and mysteries that will never be solved. And you are safe in that darkness. You are held in that darkness. You are part of that darkness, and of the light that emerges from it, and of the endless cycle between the two. So sleep now. Let the thoughts dissolve. Let the questions rest. Let the ancient world fade into the dream, and the dream fade into the formless peace of deep sleep. And know that whatever happens next, whatever the morning brings, whatever the future holds, you have played your part tonight by listening, by wondering, by carrying these stories forward for a few hours more in a long chain of human memory. And that is enough. It is always enough to listen to wonder, to remember, and to rest. Good night, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it may be. Good night, sleep well, and have deep dreams, and may the ancients watch over your rest, just as they have watched over humanity since the beginning. Silent, patient, and waiting. Always waiting for us to finally understand what they have been trying to tell us from the very start.